question that I get asked far and away most often is, how can I find a man that I can trust? People see my marriage and my husband and the trust and love that we have together and wonder how to find that for themselves. And it's true that modern dating is especially tricky because you're navigating so much more than just finding the right person. There are all these different dangers that exist, and there have always been dangers that exist in dating, but with the rise of AI and different technologies, those dangers have kind of increased and magnified. But while the risks have changed and even increased, it is still entirely possible to find and have a trusting relationship with a man. And I want to talk about how to do that today, not just what you need to look for, but also the person that you need to be. And first and foremost, you have to be somebody with standards. It is absolutely imperative for you to have boundaries and standards for what you will tolerate and allow in your life and for what constitutes trust to you. And when somebody does not meet those standards for trust, it is absolutely essential for you to have the ability to cut your losses, no drama, because any time that you spend trying to convince someone to meet your standards is a waste of time. There are plenty of people out in the world who are happy to meet your standards and who even have the same standards of their own for how people treat each other. So trying to convince someone who isn't meeting those standards, who repeatedly goes against those standards that you have for yourself, it's just an exercise in futility. There are absolutely trustworthy people, trustworthy men in this world, but the more time that you spend with someone who isn't trustworthy, trying to convince them to be trustworthy, that's time you lose looking for the actual people and finding the actual people who will build trust with you and hold your same standards for treatment. With this, it's really important not to have a scarcity mindset, because I know sometimes it can be easy to get into that idea and that thought loop of like, oh, I'll never be able to find someone else. This is the only person who's attracted to me, who wants to date me. But please, I beg of you, do not limit yourself. I know that when you've only had subpar experiences, it can feel like that is all that exists, but just because you haven't experienced that beautiful, wonderful, trusting love that meets your standards doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And as a matter of fact, it absolutely does. And if you aren't experiencing it right now, that means that you need to move on from whoever you are with and go find someone who can give you that experience. There are definitely a lot of different areas where it's important to have those kind of boundaries and standards. And first of all, time is a huge one. Seeing how somebody respects your time and honors your time is a great indicator of how they will treat and respect other standards that you have going forward. But also definitely reflect on your personal standards for phone usage and the amount of openness you want to have with your phones between you and your partner, and then also openness about the past and having standards there. And there are many different areas where you can have standards. It's important to take some time to reflect on what's important to you. You know, I have my own personal standards that are important to me in certain areas of life where those standards are much more important, in other areas of my life that are flexible and I don't have as high of standards. But it's just important for you to reflect on what matters to you and enforce what matters to you, because your boundaries are your standards for life, and your standards for life are going to dictate how your life goes. If somebody isn't meeting your standards, you just have to move on. And I'm gonna move on from this point because I could spend all day talking about it. So of course, you want to have standards. It's important to have standards, but at the same time, it's also important to recognize that men are not misbehaving women. There's nothing inherently wrong with men, but they are inherently very different creatures than women are. And it's really helpful to keep that in mind when you're dating men. They are going to respond and behave differently than your mom or your sisters or your girlfriends, but there's really nothing wrong with that. And it makes perfect sense because they've been being bathed in testosterone since they were in utero. They're having a different chemical, hormonal experience than we could ever imagine, just as they could never imagine what it's like to be a woman. Their focus, their communication style, and their emotional landscape are all completely different than a woman's by and large. And that's okay, and that's something that needs to be respected. Men are very single focused. That's something that I've learned in the time I've spent with my husband. They're super single focused. They're not going to notice all of the same things that you notice, and that does not mean that they're neglectful or they don't care about you. If there's something that's a priority to you that a man is really not picking up on and doesn't inherently have that as a priority of his own, that does need to be super clearly communicated. And same thing with communication. If men are focused on one thing, they're not going to be able to fully hear when you're talking about something else. And this is just a difference. You can say that it's wrong all you want, but this difference does exist. These differences do exist. And as soon as you can accept them and roll with them, that's when you really start to get the kind of relationship and fulfillment and satisfaction in a relationship that you want. To me, these differences are really exciting, and it's a learning opportunity. It's a lens into somebody else's world. And if you're hearing me say all of this about these differences that men and women have in their emotions and their focus and their communication styles, and you just really don't like that, maybe a man is not for you. But regardless, I do encourage you to get curious about the men in your life and the way that they experience the world, and to just have a kind of human respect for the way that they operate, because it is different, but it is valuable, and it's interesting too. It's super, super different. Like, I'm learning new things about my husband every day, and part of that is because I have the respect to look at it with curiosity instead of judgment. And that's not something that's necessarily come naturally. I've had to practice that, and I continue to have to practice that because I'm so used to my way and my perception of things that his can sometimes be really bizarre, honestly. And just another piece on men's emotional landscape. My hot tip for you is that if you really want to know something about how a man is feeling, or the answer that a man has to any question, you have to ask the question and then just zip your lips. This is something that I've learned from Alison Armstrong. If anybody else has watched her content, it's unbelievably useful. But if you really want to know something, you have to allow a man to bring up the answer from within the depths of his soul. I think men can sometimes get a reputation as being superficial, and part of that is due to the fact that we as women communicate at a much more rapid rate. And so when we give a man the same amount of time that we would give a woman to communicate his response, we're not getting the full response, because his response probably takes much more time to actually be drawn out. So on top of all of these biological differences that are just kind of inherent to men and women, we're also in a bit of a pickle right now because men's and women's social roles are currently very much in flux. Now, this isn't a bad thing, but it is true that traditional gender roles used to be very strongly enforced, and this made navigating social situations much easier because everybody just kind of had a script that they could follow based on if they were a man or a woman, and this allows things to flow very smoothly. There's a certain path that you take if you're a woman, there's a certain path that you take if you're a man, and this doesn't fully exist anymore, and that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing at all. In fact, I think it's a really positive thing, but because we're in a transition period, nobody quite knows where they stand right now. In order to navigate this successfully and see ourselves through to the other side, to kind of a new wave of social dynamics and male-female relationships, we have to give each other grace, because this is very confusing for everybody involved. Instead of men being the leaders of the household, most women now are contributing equally to the household, if not also being the more educated party who makes more money. And again, this really is not a bad thing. It doesn't need to be a bad thing, but both parties just need to acknowledge that there is all of this new gray area where roles were once very clearly defined, and all of these new areas that are nebulous now need to be negotiated and discussed within each individual relationship, instead of just following the pre-prescribed script that everybody used to kind of have. So this involves basically everything in a committed relationship: money, goals, direction, who is the default parent, who is the default homemaker, who is the default income earner, who does the domestic engineering, who does the emotional leadership and emotional maintenance in the relationship, what does intimacy look like, and whose wants and needs get met how and when and by whom. And it's not even just who's in charge of what areas of life, but what specific parts of each of those areas, because it's no longer the house is the woman's domain and the outside world is the man's domain. No, everything now gets to be intertwined, and we get to have really thoughtful, deep discussions about who does what and why, and what works for who, and when things need to change and ebb and flow throughout the relationship. And I think that couples have always done this throughout history, but the need for it now is much more apparent because we don't even have tradition to fall back on necessarily. Men used to have dominance in basically every area of life, and I think that dominance is waning in a lot of ways. You see statistics about college education and income and everything, and women are really climbing in those areas, but men are still dominant physically. They're just by and large bigger and stronger. And because of that, protection in dating and finding a trustworthy man remains a very important consideration. Of course, physical protection, as I'm saying, men are bigger and stronger, but also emotional protection. And the most effective way that you could protect your heart and protect your whole self when it comes to dating is to listen to the other men in your life about the men that you date. So any man that you trust, that is in a position of trust with you already, that is not in a romantic position with you in any way, whether that is a brother or a father, an uncle, some relative, or a friend's husband, a friend's boyfriend, a friend's brother, somebody that you can trust, that you know doesn't have any skin in the game, if you will. Someone who has your best interest at heart and who has nothing to lose by telling you the truth about other men's behavior. And even in your own consideration of men, I think a great qualities to look for are men who have a discipline of some sort. So whether that is martial arts or some sport that they do, or even just lifting weights, any physical or intellectual pursuit speaks highly to a man's character, to his discipline, to his follow through, and to his trustworthiness. He obviously is somebody who says he's going to do something and then follows up and does it. Of course, this isn't a guarantee of him being a character match with you in every way, but I do think it's a good jumping off point. My husband, for example, he does lift weights and he has athletic pursuits, but he also does this, it's a Japanese skill toy called kendama. You might have seen it online, but it's just kind of like a hand-eye coordination thing that he practices all the time, and it's just like a fun outlet for him. Even something as simple as that, you know, like he doesn't have to be the biggest, strongest, buffest guy or a black belt in Taekwondo or whatever, but just having something that he hones in on that is like in the real world, you know, not video games. Video games do not count, but it could be intellectual, it could be physical, but it definitely speaks to a higher level of character when a man has some sort of pursuit like that in his life. Now, when it comes to dating, I know that us as women have this tendency, I've experienced it many times myself, but this tendency to perform for a man. You see a man and there's like a switch in your brain that just goes, okay, just be pleasing. Do whatever you think he would like best, and that can make dating really, really difficult. Again, speaking from experience, because you're thinking about the other person the whole entire time and you're just trying to twist and warp yourself into something that you think they would like. And then by the end of the night, you're so exhausted by that whole ordeal that you haven't even observed if you actually like him or not. And this really actually makes it difficult for a relationship of trust to form because you aren't being your authentic self. And so whether a man likes you or not, it doesn't feel like you can even really trust it because you know that his feelings about you are based on a false perception. So instead of engaging in this performance, I suggest, and I enjoy personally, observing. Flipping the script. Instead of you trying to perform for him, really start honing in, like get really locked in. Who is he? Who is he? You know, like take a good hard look at him and really observe him throughout your night or throughout your date, throughout your time together. You know, a person can say anything, right? But their actions don't lie. Their actions will tell you who they are. Their actions will tell you if they're earnest, if they're open, if they're being honest. Their actions will tell you if they're confident, if they know who they are, or if they're really insecure. So in this observation, instead of performing, you observe, and what you observe is your compatibility, not just if you like their strengths, if you like their good qualities, but also observe their weaknesses. Every guy has them. Every person has weaknesses. And if you can observe and lock in on what a guy's weaknesses are, then you can decide, okay, maybe his weakness is something that you find charming, or at the very least it's quite harmless. Maybe you notice a red flag that makes you think, oh, yeah, no, we shouldn't be doing this at all. But it is important to think about that, to think about weaknesses and flaws, because those are things that are going to be a part of your life and you get to choose, right? When you are dating, you get to choose what kind of person you let into your life, what kind of flaws they have when you let them into your life. This can also be why it's really good to look for a man who has discipline as one of his strengths, because this can mean that he's more likely to overcome any weaknesses that he has. But just know that you're always going to find some sort of imperfection in whoever you decide to date, and that's not a bad thing, but you can be wise about what sort of imperfections you can accept in somebody and what sort of imperfections make you go, okay, maybe not, maybe you're not the one. But I will just reiterate again, it is super important to look for somebody who is confident, who is honest and open, and who knows who they are. They don't need to know exactly who they are. They don't need to know exactly where they're going in life, but it's super important for him to have a strong sense of himself and just inherent confidence and comfortability, because when a man has that quality, he's much more likely to be open and trustworthy and just be real with you. And that's really what you're looking for, right? In a trusting relationship, is somebody who's just gonna be real with you and who you can just be real with in return. That is probably one of the greatest joys of my marriage. And part of that is because my husband knows who he is. Of course, we all have our moments of low confidence, and that's totally fine. But by and large, my husband is confident, and I'm confident as well. And that makes our relationship that much more trusting, because neither of us have insecurities constantly in our ear telling us, oh, the other person is doing such and such thing, or they don't really love you, blah, 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 whatever it is. Having that centeredness and groundedness in yourself is what makes that centeredness and groundedness and openness come in a relationship. Most importantly though, trust is built over time. It's really not thrilling. It's calm, it's consistent, it's steady, it's incremental, and there's really no rush. You can take your time to learn about somebody, volunteer a piece of vulnerable information, and see what they do with it. Give them an opportunity to share something vulnerable with you, and respond with kindness and openness, and slowly over time, that is how you build a trusting relationship. You give them a piece of you, see how they take care of it. They give you a piece of them, then you give them another, then you ask them for help, and you slowly build this mutual bond. And being vulnerable with somebody is not just telling them like hard things that have happened in your past or the things that you struggle with. It's also a huge part of it is just saying no. Being honest when you're not feeling something, when you're not ready for something, when you don't want to move into something. For me, my example of this, when I started dating my husband, we would go out on a date and then we'd come back to my house and we would just sit on the porch and talk. That on its own was me setting a standard and saying no. I don't want you in my house. I don't want to have that like dance of like will we, won't we, you know. I just want to keep it clean, keep it outside on the porch, we can talk. After a few dates, a few weeks of doing that, we were talking on my porch and he leaned in to kiss me. And I didn't want to kiss him yet. I just wasn't ready. So I just put my hand on his chest. I don't remember exactly what I said, something like, not tonight or whatever, and just moved on and continued the conversation. And honestly, this was a really pivotal moment for our relationship, because I know if I had just been like, oh, no, I'll just kiss him, I would have eroded any possibility of trust in our relationship, because I would have eroded for the umpteenth time my trust with my own self. When there's something I don't want to do, I'm the only person that knows that. And in order to do right by myself and to actually give the relationship a chance to thrive, I have to be the one to communicate that. And it's very uncomfortable. It is scary to think that you might not get a good response, and you might not always get a good response, but that's really good information for you too. If somebody responds poorly to you saying no to something simple that you just don't feel comfortable doing, that's really good data for you to file away, because maybe they're not the person for you, and maybe they're not going to respect bigger things that come up in the future. I know in the case of me and my husband, he really respected the fact that I was honest about not wanting to do that I didn't make him look like a fool, but I did calmly just enforce that I didn't want to do that, and that we continued to have a good time. You know, it's completely possible to show your interest to somebody without bending over backwards and just doing whatever they want. Just because they want something and you're interested in them doesn't mean you have to give it to them in order to prove that you're interested in return. You can take things at your own pace, and this is all a part of that negotiation piece that I mentioned earlier. Like, these are just the things that you have to navigate in having an intimate, close, vulnerable romantic, committed relationship with somebody. You're not always going to want exactly what they want, and they're not always going to want exactly what you want. And that's why it's so important to be honest and to be able to trust that the other person is being honest with you. It may seem kind of counterintuitive, but seriously, when you are straight up with the person that you're dating, that invites them to do the same. If they don't see it as an invitation of trust, then they are obviously not looking for a trusting relationship. That's okay. Good to know, you can move on. The other really important facet of trust is that you need to trust your gut. There are way too many times where I had a gut feeling about something relationship-wise, and I didn't act on it, I didn't trust it, and it turned out to be true, and I could have saved myself a lot of heartache and a lot of time spent with the wrong people if I had just trusted my gut sooner and gotten out of there as soon as something felt off. You can absolutely trust your gut, and you can also trust that what you see is what you get. You don't need to do mental gymnastics of like, oh well, maybe he'll change, or maybe this isn't as bad as I think it is. No, what you see is normally what you get with somebody, and if you don't like what you see, don't pursue it any further. Ultimately though, a man's character will be revealed to you by the challenges that he faces and that you face together. This will of course happen over time, but it can also be revealed very early on just by what's going on in his life at the time when you meet him. If his life is a hot mess, if he's dealing with a lot, if he's surrounded by chaos and everything seems to be going wrong, that's probably how his life normally looks. Granted, there are always exceptions to that, but do notice, and also notice how he responds to all of these challenges. Is he fatalistic, or does he buckle down and do the work to get himself out of whatever hole he finds himself in? Obviously, nobody is perfect, but when you're trying to build a really trusting, deep bond with somebody, you want that person to strive to be who they say they are, to do what they say they're gonna do, someone who is willing to be wrong and willing to be challenged, because these are all parts of building trust and having a committed, long-term trusting relationship. And again, these things just take time. The truth of who somebody is will be revealed to you in time. The truth of your relationship will be revealed in time, and the amount of trust that you have with somebody will increase in time. More than likely though, in your dating life, there will be some trial and error, some rinse and repeat. You will try somebody on for size, go out on dates with them, observe them, look at their character, and you'll find that it is unsatisfactory and they're not someone who's interested in building the same kind of bond that you are, and then you move on and you try again with someone else. I've personally experienced in my life this, I think it's called the sunk cost fallacy, where it's like, well, I put so much effort into being with this person, I put so much into our relationship, you know, financial, emotional, practical, all of this time, that I should just keep going. No, I beseech you to never think about your life and your relationships in those terms. Starting over is never as hard as you think it will be, and yes, it can be quite difficult, but it is much easier and much more liberating than feeling like you are just stuck with somebody for the rest of your life just because you've already put in so much time with them. A year or two is really nothing. 5 years is really nothing in the grand scheme of things. When you're dating, it is to figure out whether or not you want somebody in your life. So don't just decide to keep somebody in your life before you've actually decided if you want them there or not. If you discover that you don't want them there, even though you thought that you would, that is okay. That's what dating is for. That's why you take your time to get to know somebody before you get married. But please just remember that your goal is not to create a trustworthy guy, it is to find one and to create a relationship built on trust with him. And I'll only say this one more time, but please do not waste your time trying to convince somebody to meet your standards. Instead, look for the guy who wants to and who has standards of his own. Thank you.